A blizzard buries Bitter Creek Valley in 1887, where a single lantern flickers against the merciless Wyoming snow. Nora Bell, a widow scarred by loss, braves the storm to keep two elderly souls alive, driven by a debt etched deep in her heart. Elias Brandt, the haunted mountain ghost, returns to a home warmed by a stranger's kindness, a kindness he might not deserve. Their collision sparks a tale of redemption and sacrifice where one light refuses to die. Will Nora's mercy thaw a frozen heart, or will the storm claim them all? Subscribe now, share where you're listening from, and uncover the fire that changed a mountain forever. What secrets does the lantern hold? Snow choked the Bitter Creek Valley, Wyoming Territory, in the winter of 1887. The third blizzard in a month, clawing at the earth like a starved wolf. The world was a white void, swallowing sound, breath, and hope. At the valley's edge, a lone cabin crouched against the storm, its chimney bare of smoke, a silent cry for help. Inside lived the Brandts, an old couple too stubborn to beg, parents of Elias Brandt, the mountain ghost, a hunter whose name drifted through town like a half-forgotten legend. He'd been gone weeks, hauling traps and rifles through the high timber, leaving his kin to face the cold alone. Nora Bell saw it first, from her own shack, a mile off through frozen pines. She'd watched that chimney for days. No smoke, no life. The widow, barely 25, carried her own ghosts. Her husband, Tom, gunned down last spring by cattle rustlers. The elder Brandt had saved Tom once years back, pulling him from a stampede's path when he was still green to the saddle. That dead-end gnawed at Nora, sharp as the wind cutting through her threadbare shawl. She couldn't let the old man's kindness die with him. Dawn broke gray, the sky heavy as iron. Nora lit her last oil lantern, its flame a frail pulse against the dark. She tucked a pot of barley soup under one arm, a sack of kindling under the other, and stepped into the snow. Her boots crunched, each step a battle against drifts that reached her knees. The lantern swung, casting jittery shadows on the white expanse. A beacon in a world gone blind. Her cheeks stung raw from the cold, but she pressed on, driven by something deeper than duty. Maybe defiance, maybe redemption. The Brandt cabin loomed ahead, its logs dark and slick with ice. Nora's breath steamed as she shoved the door open, half expecting to find death waiting. Instead, she saw them, old man Brandt slumped by a cold stove, his wife Mary curled on a cot, their hands clasped like they'd held on through 50 winters. Their faces were gaunt, lips cracked blue, but their eyes flickered with life. Nora didn't speak. Words were a luxury out here. She knelt, struck a match, and coaxed the stove to life. Flames licked the kindling, spitting sparks, and the room began to thaw. She ladled soup into tin mugs, the steam curling like a prayer. Old Brandt's hand shook as he took him, his eyes glassy with gratitude he couldn't voice. Mary tried to speak, her voice a dry rasp. "You didn't have to, child." Nora shook her head, brushing it off. "Eat," she said, soft but firm, stirring the pot with a wooden spoon worn smooth as river rock. She swept snow from the floor, stacked firewood by the door, and checked the window cracks for drafts. Every move was deliberate, like she was stitching a wound. This wasn't her first visit. For a week, she'd come at dawn, leaving her own home, a shack barely warmer than the grave, to tend to these forgotten souls. The town below, huddled around its saloon and church, had turned its back on the Brandts. Folks called Nora the Lantern Widow, a name whispered with pity or scorn. Her husband's death had left her nothing but a patch of frostbitten land and a hardened against gossip. She didn't care. She moved like the snow itself, quiet, steady, unnoticed. Mary sipped her soup, her eyes tracing Nora's worn boots, the patched shawl clinging to her shoulders. "You're too young to carry this," she murmured. Nora didn't answer, just poured another ladle. The old woman's words hung in the air, heavy as the storm outside. Brant coughed, a rough hack that rattled his frame, and pointed to a chair. "Sit, girl, warm yourself." Nora hesitated, then perched on the edge, her hand still gripping the lantern. Its light danced on the walls, a small defiance against the dark. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the shutters. Snow pressed against the windows, dimming the room to a great haze. Nora stood, fastening her shawl. "I'll be back tomorrow," she said, her voice low but certain. The old couple watched her go, their eyes holding something like awe. She stepped into the storm, the lantern's glow swallowed by white. The path back was a memory, each step a gamble against the cold. Above the mountains loomed silent judges of her stubborn mercy. Somewhere miles off, Elias Brant rode toward home, unaware of the light keeping his blood alive. Miles away, under a sky bruised black with storm, Elias Brant urged his horse through the Wyoming snow, the weight of his past, heavier than the frozen traps slung across his saddle. The Bitter Creek Valley, 1887, was a merciless place, and he was its ghost, known to the town's folk as the Mountain Ghost, a man carved from silence and regret. Weeks in the high timber had left him battered, his shoulder gashed from a rustler's blade, the same kind of men he'd once ridden with before shame drove him to the mountains. His parents' cabin was his only tether to the world below, and he rode hard, expecting to find it dark and cold. The storm roared, a beast gnashing at his back. But as Elias crested the ridge, a thin wisp of smoke curled from the cabin's chimney, faint against the blizzard's howl. His gut twisted. His parents, old and frail, couldn't keep a fire that steady. Rustlers maybe, or squatters sniffing out an empty home. His hand tightened on the rifle, the cold steel biting his palm. He dismounted, boots sinking into drifts, and crept toward the cabin, the wind swallowing the crunch of his steps. Through a frost-rimmed window, he saw shadows move, too many for just his folks. A stranger was inside. He shoved the door open, snow swirling in his wake, rifle raised. The air hit him warm, thick, with the smell of barley soup and burning pine. His parents sat by the stove, alive, their faces lit by a glow he hadn't seen in years. Between them stood a woman, slight but steady, her hand cradling a ladle over a steaming pot, her eyes wide and gray as the storm outside locked on his. For a moment, the room held its breath, the only sound the wind screaming through the open door. "Who sent you?" Elias growled, his voice rough as gravel, the rifle still trained on her. The woman, Nora Bell, though he didn't know her name, didn't flinch, but her hands trembled slightly, betraying the calm in her face. "Debt," she said, her voice low, cutting through the tension like a knife through leather. "A debt I owed your father." Her words hung sharp and true, but Elias's pride, raw from weeks of running and bleeding, wouldn't bend. He'd left his parents to fend for themselves, and now a stranger stood in his place, stirring soup in his home. "You've got no right here," he snapped, lowering the rifle but not his guard. "This ain't your kin." Nora's gaze didn't waver, though her lips tightened. They were hungry. She said simply, "I meant only to help." Her shawl, patched and thin, clung to her shoulders as she set the ladle down, deliberate, like she was laying down a challenge. Old Brant coughed, a wet, rattling sound, and raised a trembling hand. "Son," he rasped, "this woman kept us breathing. You owe her more than a harsh word." Elias's jaw clenched. Guilt churned in his chest, hot and bitter, mixing with the fear that had ridden him down the mountain. He'd run from rustlers, from blood on his hands, from the man he'd been when he rode with killers. Now this woman, small, stubborn, with hands cracked red from the cold, had done what he couldn't. "You should have gone to town," he said, his voice cracking like a dry branch. "Not here." Nora's eyes glistened, but she didn't break. She nodded once, wordless, and pulled her shawl tighter. Without another sound, she grabbed her lantern, its flame flickering like a dying star, and stepped into the storm. The door slammed shut, snow dusting the floor. Elias stood frozen, the warmth of the cabin mocking him. His mother, Mary, struggled to her feet, her voice sharp despite its frailty. "You fool," she hissed. "You chased off the one light left for us." His father's eyes, heavy with disappointment, bore into him. Elias turned to the stove, staring at the pot, its steam curling like an accusation. The fire crackled, fed by wood Nora had hauled through the snow. He sank onto a chair, his wound throbbing, his hands rough and useless. Outside, the blizzard screamed, erasing Nora's tracks, but her presence lingered, a quiet rebuke in the air. That night, Elias didn't sleep. The wind howled, rattling the cabin like bones in a tin cup. He saw her face in the fire's glow, those steady eyes, that stubborn sat of her jaw. His parents' words echoed, cutting deeper than the rustler's blade. He'd failed them, left them to starve, and a stranger had carried the weight he'd dropped. The lantern's light, faint in his memory, burned brighter than his shame. By dawn, the storm hadn't broken, but something in Elias had. He pulled on his coat, the cold biting his wound, and stepped outside, driven by a need he couldn't name, to find the woman who'd lit a fire he didn't deserve. Dawn broke over Bitter Creek, Wyoming territory in 1887. The storm's fury dulled to a low moan, leaving the valley draped in a silver hush. Elias Brandt stood outside his parents' cabin, the cold gnawing at his wounded shoulder, his eyes fixed on the snow where Nora Bell's lantern had flickered hours before. Her stubborn mercy had shamed him, a stranger's light burning where his had failed. He couldn't let her vanish into the white. Rifle slung over his back, he followed the faint trail of her steps, each one a whisper of his guilt, pulling him toward a redemption he didn't yet understand. The path wound through pines heavy with ice, their branches groaning under the weight. Elias's breath steamed, his boots crunching through drifts that hid the world's edges. The lantern's glow haunted him, a pinpoint of fire in his mind, defiant against the storm. He found it half buried near a frozen creek, its oil nearly spent but still burning, a stubborn spark in the snow. A few yards off, Nora lay slumped against a gnarled cedar, her shawl crusted with ice, her arms locked around a bundle of firewood. Her face was pale, lips faintly blue, but her chest rose, stubborn as the mountain itself. Elias dropped to his knees, his hands trembling as he brushed snow from her face. "You're tougher than this damn winter," he muttered, his voice rough but soft like gravel smoothed by a stream. He lifted her, her weight slight against his broad frame, and wrapped his coat around her, its leather heavy with frost. The lantern he tucked under his arm, its flame a quiet promise. The trek back to the cabin was slow, the wind biting at his exposed skin, but he moved steadily, her breath against his chest, the only warmth in the world. Inside, the cabin glowed faintly, the stove's fire still alive from Nora's last efforts. Elias laid her near it, piling blankets over her shivering form. His parents stirred, Mary's eyes widening with fear, then softening as she saw Nora's face. "She's alive," Elias said, more to himself than them as he stoked the fire higher. For 3 days, Nora drifted in fever, her body fighting the cold that had nearly claimed her. Elias never left her side. He boiled water, changed the cloths on her brow, and cooked soup from what little they had, his hands clumsy but careful, learning the work she'd done so easily. By the third night, Nora stirred, her eyes fluttering open to the fire's glow. Elias sat across from her, his face haggarded, the lines etched deeper by guilt. She tried to sit up, wincing. "I didn't mean to overstep," she whispered, her voice faint as a breeze through dry grass. Elias shook his head, his throat tight. "You did what I couldn't," he said. "You saw my folks when I was too blind to." The words hung heavy, a confession carved from shame. He handed her a tin mug of broth, his fingers brushing hers rough against her cracked skin. The fire light danced, casting shadows that seemed to listen. Elias spoke, his voice low, like he was afraid the truth would shatter the room. He told her of his past, riding with rustlers, men who'd kill for a handful of cattle. He'd watched them gun down a man by 8. Stockyard, his screams echoing in Elias's dreams. I ran from it, he admitted, staring into the flames, but it follows me still. Nora's breath caught, her eyes darkening. She knew that man, her husband Tom, dead in the dirt last spring. She turned away, the fire's heat stinging her tears. Elias braced for her anger, but Nora only looked at him, her gaze steady as stone. Saving your folks, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, was my way of saving what Tom died for. The words cut deeper than any blade, binding their pain in a fragile truce. They sat in silence, the fire crackling, the cabin a small island in the endless snow. If this story of mercy and redemption resonates with you folks, consider subscribing to keep these tales alive. Share where you're listening from, and let's keep the fire burning. Days passed, the storm easing into a brittle calm. Elias and Nora worked side by side, splitting wood, tending the stove, their movements falling into a quiet rhythm. His parents watched, their eyes holding hope they hadn't dared to feel. The valley outside lay still, but whispers of Nora's presence in the cabin began to creep down to town, carried on the wind like ash. Trouble wasn't far off, and Elias knew it. Rustlers didn't forgive, and his past was riding hard to find him. Whispers of Norable living with the mountain ghost slithered through Bitter Creek, Wyoming territory in the winter of 1887, curling like smoke down to the town's saloon and church. The valley lay quiet, the snow settling into a brittle crust, but the air carried a restless edge like the hum before a lightning strike. Elias Bront felt it in his bones, a warning sharper than the ache in his wounded shoulder. The rustlers he'd betrayed years ago weren't the forgiving kind, and their shadows were closing in, drawn by the scent of his defiance. Inside the cabin, Nora and Elias moved in a careful dance, splitting logs and tending the stove, their silences filled with an unspoken understanding. His parents, old Brant and Mary, watched with eyes that held a fragile hope, their hands clasped tighter each day. But the town's gossip reached the ridge by midday, carried by a deputy named Hollies, a lanky man with a smirk and a past of trailing Nora like a hound after scraps. He rode up, his horse snorting steam, and banged on the cabin door, his badge glinting dully in the pale sun. "Folks say you're harboring a woman up here, Brant," Hollies drawled, leaning against the doorframe, his eyes flicking to Nora as she stacked firewood. "Ain't proper, her living with a man like you." Elias stepped forward, his frame filling the doorway, his voice cold as iron. "If kindness is a crime, Hollies, you'd best build more jails." The deputy's smirk faltered, but he spat into the snow and mounted his horse, muttering about trouble brewing. Elias shut the door, his jaw tight, knowing the deputy's words were a spark in dry grass. Night fell hard, the sky black as cold dust. The cabin's warmth felt fragile, like a single candle in a gale. Elias sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle, its barrel gleaming with oil. Nora mended a torn blanket, her needle flashing in the firelight, her face calm but watchful. The old couple slept, their breaths uneven in the quiet. Then it came, distant at first, a low rumble, like thunder trapped in the earth, hooves too many. Elias's head snapped up, his eyes meeting Nora's. "Rustlers," he said, voice low, handing her an old Colt revolver. "If they break the door, shoot the first shadow." The storm woke with a vengeance. Wind screaming through the pines, snow lashing the cabin like buckshot. Elias slipped outside, rifle in hand, his coat whipping in the gale. The darkness was a living thing, swallowing the world beyond the cabin's glow. Nora stayed by the door, her grip steady on the revolver, her breath shallow. The hooves grew louder, shadows moving in the white chaos. A gunshot cracked, sharp and final, followed by a man's scream. Elias was out there fighting ghosts from his past, men who'd kill to settle a score. Nora's heart pounded, but she didn't freeze. She grabbed her lantern, its flame a stubborn flicker, and hung it on a hook outside the door, its light cutting through the blizzard like a blade. The glow was faint, a beacon in the white hell, guiding Elias through the storm. Gunfire erupted, flashes lighting the snow like lightning. A figure lunged toward the cabin, and Nora raised the Colt, her hand steady despite the cold biting her fingers. The man fell before she fired, Elias's shadow looming behind him, blood staining the snow. The fight was brutal. Quick, Elias moved like a wolf, his rifle barking, each shot precise despite the storm's fury. The rustlers, 5 in all, fell one by one, their curses lost in the wind. The last, a man with a scar across his cheek. Elias knew him, the leader he'd betrayed, charged with a knife. Elias met him head-on, their struggle a blur of steel and snow. A final shot rang out, and the man collapsed, his blood steaming in the cold. Elias staggered, a fresh gash across his ribs, and fell to his knees at the cabin's threshold, the lantern's light bathing his face. "You kept that lantern burning," he gasped, blood soaking his shirt, his eyes locked on Nora's. She dropped to his side, her hands trembling as she pressed a cloth to his wound. "So did you," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing her chest. The storm raged on, but inside the cabin held fast. Its fire, a defiant pulse. Old Brant stirred, his cough breaking the silence while Mary whispered a prayer. The lantern swayed outside, its light unbroken, a testament to the fight for something worth saving. The lantern's light swayed outside the cabin, a lone star in the Wyoming night, its glow unbroken despite the storm's dying roar. Bitter Creek Valley, 1887, lay hushed, the snow stained with blood and silence. Elias Brant slumped against the cabin door, his breath ragged, blood seeping from the gash in his ribs. Nora Bell knelt beside him, her hands steady as she pressed a torn cloth to his wound, her eyes fierce with a will that refused to let him fade. Fire inside crackled, a defiant heartbeat, while old Brant and Mary stirred, their prayers a soft murmur against the wind's fading howl. Dawn crept over the mountains, pale and sharp, painting the snow gold. Elias clung to life, his chest rising under Nora's care. She worked without pause, boiling water, tearing strips from her shawl to bind his wounds. Her hands, cracked and raw, moved with a quiet strength, as if stitching together more than flesh. Mary shuffled to her side, pressing a frail hand to Nora's shoulder. "You've brought the light back, child," she whispered, her voice worn as old leather. Old Brant coughed, his eyes wet, and muttered, "Angels don't always come with wings." Nora didn't answer, her focus on Elias, but a warmth flickered in her chest, unfamiliar and heavy. By midday, Elias stirred, his eyes finding hers in the dim cabin. Pain etched his face, but his voice was steady. "You didn't let me die," he said, low like a confession. Nora's lips twitched, not quite a smile. Didn't seem right to let the mountain win. She handed him a tin of broth, their fingers brushing, a silent vow in the touch. The cabin felt different now, its walls holding something new, a fragile trust built from shared survival. Outside, the snow softened, the valley gleaming like polished bone under a weak sun. Days turned to weeks, the winter loosening its grip. Elias healed slowly, his strength returning with each sunrise. He and Nora fell into a rhythm, chopping wood, mending the cabin, their silences no longer heavy, but companionable. The townsfolk's whispers grew louder, tales of the lantern widow and the mountain ghost twisting into gossip. Some called it a scandal, others madness, but Elias didn't care. When he rode to town for supplies, a shopkeeper sneered. "That woman's trouble, Brant." Elias fixed him with a stare, cold as a frozen creek. "Trouble's what I left in the snow," he said, and walked away, his boots kicking up dust. One evening as the fire burned low, Elias sat beside Nora. The cabin quiet, save for the old couple's soft snores. He pulled a small ring from his pocket, its silver dulled by years. His mother kept after his first wife's passing. He turned it in his callous hands, the metal catching the fire light. "This valley's taken a lot from us both," he said, his voice rough but sure. "But it gave me you." Nora's breath caught, her eyes tracing the ring. She didn't speak, but her hand closed over his, the ring warm between them. The mountains bore witness, their peaks glinting like glass. No preacher came, no bells rang, just the two of them, the fire and a promise carved in silence. Mary woke, her eyes bright with tears, and whispered, "The Lord names those who earn it. You're no widow." Now, Nora's throat tightened, the weight of her old name falling away like snow from a warmed roof. Elias stood, helping her to her feet, his hand steady on her arm. Outside, the lantern hung, its flame a quiet sentinel. Years later, Bitter Creek remembered. When blizzards swept the valley, travelers spoke of a light on the ridge, faint but unyielding, guiding lost souls through the white. Some swore it was Nora's spirit, others Elias's vigil, but the old folks knew better. They told of a woman who carried mercy through the snow and a man who found redemption in her fire. The cabin stood long after, its chimney smoke rising steadily, a column against the sky. The lantern's glow became legend, a spark that never died, proof that in the harshest winters, kindness could burn brighter than any storm. The valley stretched endlessly, its snow touched with dawn's gold. Elias and Nora lived on, their lives woven into the mountain's heart, their story whispered in the wind. Lantern, battered but unbroken, hung by the door, its light a promise kept. Mercy, the old folks said, passing the tale to their kin, was the only fire that never went out in these mountains. And as the sun rose, the ridge gleamed, every tree heavy with ice that shone like hope. The lantern's glow fades, but its story lingers in Bitter Creek snows, a testament to mercy's enduring fire. Elias and Nora, bound by loss and redemption, carved a light that Wyoming's winters couldn't snuff out. What did their tales stir in you? Share your thoughts. Where does this story hit you hardest? Your reflections keep these mountain legends alive. Gratitude for joining this journey through the 1,887 frontier. Your presence fuels the fire. Ride back with us soon for another tale where the heart battles the cold. Until then, keep your own lantern burning and let the valley's whispers guide